Yo, what is up gamers? Fishman here, and today will be the birth of a new series on my channel. I'm gonna call it League Theories, and no, I'm not making theories about how Seraphine's hoverboard is sentient. We already know that. But more analytical take on theorizing what may be the best for certain champions. What I'm gonna be doing is collecting data, usually through the custom tools, and I know some people test it out every now and again, but I want to go more in depth and see what really is the strongest for a champion. Today, we're going to be theorizing the best build on Katarina and what items should be the first item she gets for the strongest power spike she can possibly have, and discussing what of these items that I'm going to choose will make the strongest core for her, and the rest of the build you can have for yourself, use for situations. The items that we will be going over in this video, I know there are a lot more, but these are the ones I chose, and they are Night Harvester, Riftmaker, Liandry's, Kraken Slayer, Lichbane, Nashor's Tooth, and of course Bork or Blade of the Rune King, whichever you prefer, but I'm going to probably be using Bork for this whole video. Yeah, these are the items that I've decided I'm going to test out with Katarina, and I hope you enjoy. Katarina, a champ that I've been seeing build Bork a lot. Why though? Because of the changes they've done to her passive and her R. They now apply on hit, so a lot of people have been building these items. So I set out to test what items by themselves are actually the best for her. Spoiler alert, it was Bork, but let's not get ahead of ourselves here. First, we gotta gather some of the damage on Katarina without any items, just at level 8. I chose this level because you tend to already have about one item around this time, and it's a baseline that will keep throughout the whole testing. I decided we needed 4 different targets to get a broad idea of how her damage will affect different champions. Squishies, brawlers, bruisers, and tanks. I also tested the damage. The damage I tested for her was a 1 dagger, so 1 passive, a full combo, so that means Q, E, W, 1 auto, and R. I also decided to only use 1 auto and not as many autos as I could fit in that time span between her daggers coming down, because not all items will be able to fit the same amount of autos. So I felt 1 auto would be a good, nice, just base so that you get the 12 Conqueror stacks. And because it's not possible for some items to hit 3 autos, they don't grant attack speed. And then we did 3 autos by themselves, see how the damage fared for that, and 1 ultimate to see how much damage just her ultimate does. For no items, the dagger did alright. There was nothing special. Everything was about below 100 damage, with the tank taking less than 50 HP from just the dagger. The full combos were nothing special either, with the damages ranging from 750 to 420. These 3 autos weren't that shabby either. Thanks to the Conqueror, the squishy boy took 150 damage, while the Brawler and Bruiser target damage stayed about 100, while the tank only took 88 damage from the 3 autos. Then it was just the R alone. Cat did 279 damage to the squishy boy, and it got no lower than 161 when facing the tank. Now we're going to move on to the first mythic of the items we chose today. Not every item will be a mythic. We do have Bork, Nashor's, and Lichbane. When testing, I did have to wait for each proc to reset on the targets for fair results. For just 1 dagger, we do see a jump in damage compared to no items. To be expected. We get 227 damage compared to the less than 100 damage, and it does go down to 131 when fighting the tank. When we do a full combo though, we get above 1k, which is nice. Against the squishy, the full combo does 1129 with Night Harvester, and it does fall off, going from 1129 to 991 versus the brawler, to 749 to 645 versus the tank. This item damage doesn't seem to hold out very well in extended fights. It's not really good against tanks, but it's not its purpose. It is to pop squishies. And for the 3 autos, they were okay. They were about the same as when you only used one dagger. So for 3 autos versus squishy, you got a 266, which isn't bad. But versus the tank, it did go down, and it only did 154 versus the tank. With just the ult, the damage isn't bad, but we also see the same downwards trend we have with the full combo, starting off at 460 and then dropping to 405 for the brawler, which albeit isn't that bad, to 328 for the bruiser and 265 for the tank. Now we move on to Riftmaker. To make this fair, I had to do 2 tests, with and without it fully stacked, when doing the full combo and the ultimate. But I digress. With 1 dagger, the damage is very subpar because it doesn't have time to stack up. It only does 114 damage versus the squishy, and it goes down as well to only 66 versus the tank. Now, to be honest, this isn't much better damage-wise compared to the Night Harvester, especially with 80 ability power, but I digressed. Next, we see the full combo, which has 887 at the top of the damage versus squishies, and drops to 867 versus brawlers, which actually isn't that bad, but it also only has 20 more MR and armor than the squishy. And then we have the bruiser, which takes 735 damage, and the tank only takes 504. There is a sharp drop there. These numbers aren't that far off though compared to the Night Harvester, though the more important thing is when it's fully stacked the damage is there, but this also means you need to be in a prolonged fight. As a squishy, that's not the best option. Thankfully this item does have health and omnivamp for a little bit of sustain. As for damage when stacked up, it jumps from 887 to 1195 against the squishy. That is a considerable jump, so maybe stacking might be the best option. 867 to 1039 versus the brawler, and 748 versus the bruiser, and 625 versus the tank. Not bad, but the Riftmaker full combo is still a little bit better. We're going to skip over the 3 autos, for the damage isn't really noteworthy, and hop to the R only. Unstacked version, the damage is 434, while it's stacked it is 497 versus the squishy, which isn't that big of a jump. It is only 60 damage extra, but that is 60 damage extra. It's the difference between getting and not getting a kill. This is actually a little better than Night Harvester, which damage does sit at 460. We are going to breeze past the next few ones. So brawler 385 to 445, bruiser 310 to 373, and for the tank 251 to 316. This item isn't bad, but unlike Night Harvester, which could be good versus an all squishy team, I don't know if this item really fits in with Cat's build, but I could be wrong. Next item that I tested is Liandry's Anguish, which is a dot item that has damage that scales with a small amount of your AP and the target's max HP, so it should fare better than the other 2 items when it comes to damage over time and damage with healthier opponents. At first, wouldn't think much of the W as it isn't really anything special, especially against the squishy with only 184 damage, but versus the brawler it does go up to 187 damage, which is quite nice considering the brawler does have more magic resist and armor. And so it's more than the squishy, which is nice. And you will see this trend again when using the Bork. And the damage does go back down though to 132 versus the tank with a full combo. We get to see some decent damage with 1232 versus squishy, 1157 versus the brawler, 930 versus the bruiser, and finally 776 damage versus the tank. There is a sharp decline from brawler to bruiser, but overall it did more damage per each target than Night Harvester and Riftmaker. So the thing is, with Liandry's is when you move towards the autos, well, it's essentially just base damage. There is no more extra auto damage, which was to be expected, except for me, I guess. Everyone probably knew, but me. When it comes to R alone, the damage starting off is 534 going to 499 against the brawler, 394 versus the bruiser, and 326 versus the tank, which wraps this item up. In all honesty, this item on Cat feels better than Riftmaker, but the Night Harvester may feel better depending on what build you're going with, since its burst does also scale with your AP. But if you're going with an AP build on Cat, you might as well close my video out now, because our next item is its Kraken Slayer. With Kraken Slayer, at first when looking at the dagger damage, there is nothing special, considering it does only 30 more damage with one dagger versus the squishy, and if you had no item. But that's not really the important thing about this item, which is where you get most of your damage from, and that's your auto and your ult. But yes, your daggers can also proc your third stack, if you already have the 2 stacks required to proc it. So talking about the autos and ults, we move on to the combos, which is where we get the big boy numbers from. This is the first item that has above 1k damage versus all targets. The squishy starts with 1534 damage, and each target afterwards from the brawler takes 1420, bruiser takes 1259, and finally the tank takes 1194 damage, which isn't that bad all things considered. And we move on to the 3 autos, which again are high compared to the items tested so far, with 425 versus the squishy, and the tank taking 300 damage, meaning versus the tank, you don't drop as much damage as with other items. That's to be expected from an item named Kraken Slayer. With the ult, we almost break 1k damage versus squishy, with 916 damage. This would almost be enough to kill it if this were an actual match, and that's just one ability. It then goes down to 863 versus the brawler and 7087 versus the bruiser, and finally versus the tank, 726 damage. This item compared to the other mythic damage wise does a lot more damage, considering that Cat's ult scales with attack speed, and the mythic bonus is 10% attack speed per item. That isn't bad for Cat, not at all. Now we move on to the normal items. We have 3 normal items we will also be testing, which is Lich, Nashers, and Bork. With Lich, the damage on just one dagger is between that of Night Harvester and Liandry's, with the damage sitting at 214 versus Squishy's dropping to 123 versus the tank. The damage here is definitely not the worst, especially considering that this isn't a mythic. I don't think this should be your first item that you build on Cat, maybe not even the second, because as we take a look at the full combo, the hopes of doing damage that we got from looking at a single dagger just go straight down the drain. Where the full combo barely breaks 1000 damage versus the squishy with 1050, and then it goes down to 925 versus the brawler, to 745 versus the bruiser, and finally 638 versus the tank. And when we're talking about the damage without using any abilities, with the autos, 3 autos are exactly as the same as not having any items at all. Then we have the ultimate, which has the same characteristics as the single dagger, with the damage not being bad, starting at 456 and dropping down to 266, which isn't the worst, it's definitely not the best we have seen so far. We then move on to the next item, which is Nashers, which actually has one of the same components as Bork, and it has on-hit damage, though not as good as Bork. Now this item is opposite of Lich, in which case the 1 dagger damage is a bit sad, with 147 damage versus Squishy Boy. Then it drops down to 85 versus the tank, which technically is better than Kraken Slayer when it comes to the 1 dagger. Then we move on to the full combo damage, which is definitely better than Lich Bane damage, and actually is better than all of the mythics we've tested other than Kraken Slayer, with the damage starting at 1312 versus the squishy, and going down to 1115 versus the brawler, 926 versus the bruiser, and 747 at last versus the tank, which isn't as good as Kraken, albeit, but damage is good nonetheless, especially as it is a non-mythic item. Then the 3 autos, which are pretty good as well, with 238 with 3 autos, dropping down to 132 damage versus tank. And then we have the R, which does 588 damage versus squishy, going down to 515 damage versus the brawler, 414 versus the bruiser, and finally 333 damage versus the tank. This damage on the ult alone is just a little bit better than Liandry's damage on its ult, making this one of the better items we have covered so far for Cat. But finally, we have made it to the item that everyone was probably waiting for me to tell them that it is the best item, because they already know it. And it's Bork. In all honesty, it does in fact top every other item except for one, and that's Kraken Slayer. But regardless, Bork does have an extra bonus of the slow, which can't really be properly tested on how good that is. when I'm by myself. But nonetheless, let's get on to the numbers. A single dagger damage versus the squishy does have 184. That's good and all, until you get the fact that the brawler, you do 227 damage to the brawler, and the bruiser, we go right back down to 184 damage, and finally versus the tank, 172, which means that with this item, there is no hard fall off with the one dagger, and we will see this trend continue for the combo and even the ult, making this a good item to get consistent damage versus all different types of targets. With the full combo, we get 1,311 damage versus the squishy, but it jumps up to 609 versus the brawler and back down to 1345 versus the bruiser, and finally versus the tank, it does 1280 damage, meaning that squishy versus tank, they only take a difference of 31 damage, and compared to Kraken Slayer, sure, the verse squishy isn't the best, but Bork overall does have a higher peak damage compared to Kraken Slayer. With a 1609 max compared to 1534, it also doesn't fall off as hard as compared to other items. Then we move on to the 3 auto test, which goes 524 versus squishy, to 649 versus the brawler, which is that same pattern we've seen before. Then back down to 531 versus the bruiser, and finally 500 damage flat versus the tank. Then we have just the R, which damage is not bad either. It also follows this upwards and downwards back trend, the same as all other types of tests that we tested with Bork. With 650 damage, 640 damage versus the squishy alone, up to 792 versus the brawler, and down to 653 versus the bruiser, and finally versus the tank, it did 617 damage. Overall, I do think that as a first item, this has a better power spike versus healthier targets compared to such as the Kraken Slayer. Now, the only issue I have with how people have been building Kat is that they really aren't taking the full advantage of the fact that she does do mixed damage. So Bork into Kraken Slayer wouldn't be bad, but after that, maybe think about building a Nashor's Tooth as well, and have those 3 items as your core components for whatever build you want to go. You could then do situational items such as Wit's End, or even Hourglass. Those are great situational items versus squishies or versus a team with a lot of magic damage. It all depends on how it goes. Even a Rage Blade isn't bad in a certain situation, especially if you're ahead. Maybe a Rage Blade wouldn't be a bad move. Now, boots, it always depends on what you're feeling. Maybe you're ahead so you can do attack speed boots. Maybe you need those armor boots. Maybe you just need that extra little tenacity and magic resist that you get from magic boots. It honestly depends on you. And that's the great thing about League, is you don't have to listen to what I say about building. You have full creativity over what kind of build you want to do. Will it work in the end? Maybe not. It might. Who knows? You might find the next Korean build. But in the end, it is League. And in all honesty, if you liked the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps. And leave a like. Also, if you have any other ideas, put it down in the comments. I do enjoy reading the comments. I'll see you, gamers. This is Fishman, and I am out.